My name is Sara Cochran. I am Chief Curator here, and along with my partner in crime, Eric Fischel, we co-curated the show Upstairs, which closes tomorrow, which is hard to believe. Yeah, this was fun. So I obviously am delighted to be here today. I'm very grateful to welcome Helena Hernmarck and also Toni Ross being with us today. Julianne Schwartz extends her apologies. She had hip surgery and her healing wasn't quite as quick as she thought it would be, and she just didn't think she could do the 4-hour drive. So anyway, we apologize about that, but there's so much to talk about. We're very excited. So we'll get started. So, hello, Toni.
Hi.
Hello, Helena. Mm-hmm. So you both have microphones.
Yes.
And
yes.
I thought we would start with I guess when we approached you both about the show, did you think we were crazy?
Not in the least.
No, absolutely not. And in fact, I so enjoyed our studio visit together. It was really a great conversation. I was super excited about
I think
what you were putting together.
One had almost waited for it for some decades, I think.
So what are there any things that surprised you about seeing your work upstairs, either in the architectural context or in the context of the show with the works with which you are paired? Because you two are in the room that we sort of informally call the elegant black and white room.
Well, I had been here to see the space before and was very impressed. So I think it's a perfectly ideal place to have this show in. And everything is so well planned and well thought out, and then pick a group of works that surprise everybody, I'm sure. Because I think Eric looked far and wide for material to sort of... it's not the first show here, is it? It's no.
I didn't look far and wide. I just looked to Sara.
We looked far and wide.
Okay, that's good to know. So no, I couldn't say enough good things about this space and how the show then has arranged itself in this space. It's very beautiful.
Toni.
Yeah, well, for me, I was stunned when I saw my piece installed. I had no idea that it was going to be so thoroughly interacting with the architecture. And in fact, I walked in, Eric sort of led me over there, and I was speechless because I've only seen the piece against the white wall of my studio. And when people saw it, they actually asked me if I'd created all of those little lines to go, that are on the wood frame to go along with the piece, and it feels like it grew there. It was like a brilliant installation, I think, that I would not have imagined, and also relates very much to the fact that I love responding to space. I like exploring a space and then deciding what I'm going to do in a very site-responsive way. And then being across from Helena's work, which I actually did not know before, was incredibly exciting. That whole room is extraordinary. And what was also surprising to me, because the space is so vast and there is a lot going on architecturally, that you were both able to create these smaller dialogues within the larger space that made so much sense and make a show of 46 artists not feel like it's a giant group of 46 artists, but rather these intimate conversations.
Well, the space allows that. It has different rooms, different spaces to hang things, and then you just have to hang the right thing in the right space, which I think you did.
Yeah, no problem.
It was made very easy by the generosity of artists like yourselves. I mean, Toni, your piece was extraordinary when we put it up and we realized that the rust on the steel matched so well to the white pine of the building. I mean, I think that was a surprise for us too.
I just, you're really taking it down?
That's the question.
What?
We're not giving it back.
Oh, well, there's that. Okay.
Taking it down.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah. It also made me see the piece differently. You know, that's another thing, that when a piece is, and that piece has had a lot of different, not different lives, but different placements, because it has been aged over the process of a few years. So, you know, each time it's in a different environment, it appears very differently. And so then I see new things in it, which is exciting to me. I think whenever you get work out of the studio, it changes immediately.
Well, that is true. Depends on where you look at it, absolutely. So what you're looking at here of my work, I made because I was scared to death of the gallery owner who had a little white room with 3 walls, and she was the best gallery owner in Stockholm, and she asked me to make 3 pieces for her gallery. And so it turned out to be the best thing I ever did, because I was not going to lose face in Stockholm, where I had been born. So it was important. So I'm like Toni here, very used to work for specific spaces with my corporate work, which some of you might know about. But when I do something for myself, then it is of greater interest to have a personal relationship with the idea. And the idea happened to be the bill from my accountant, of all things. It's hard to believe that that should inspire anybody. But it had this textured paper, and it was folded in 3 folds. And I just copied it on when we paid the bill, and then I saw it in black and white, and I thought, my heavens. And then I flipped it over, so I ran the back side to get over the numbers for the bill. And so then the name of the firm, Schwarz & Hofflich, turns out backwards, because I had flipped it, it wasn't embossed. So that what I was after was just to see the backside. And then I had to sign my name as obscurely as that was written backwards. So you can see it again, I think, later. And then it's called Folded Paper Once, because I then folded it again. So there's another one called Folded Paper Twice, which you will see. And I made them in 1988. It's a very long time ago. But I've hung on to them because I know that they are important for my overall production. So, and now when I look at it, I think, my heavens, how did I do this? I'd have to reinvent the weaving system, because I was weaving both the structure of the paper and the shadows, and not mix them up. So that was the trick.
It's interesting, that story about the folded paper and copying it, because one of the things that's constantly fascinating to me is the things that are left behind when I'm making other work. Mm-hmm. Like if I'm rolling out slabs of clay and there's this impression of the iron that's left behind on the canvas, and then that's really interesting to me, and what do I do with that? Or the scraps, and then building from that.
Well, that's a creative process, isn't it? That you discover stuff as you're working on it.
Yeah, and discover it in what might be the detritus of the work becomes new work.
That's
for me.
Right. No, but that's how it happens. Because you're constantly in movement, and things are evolving all the time, and things are falling by the wayside, and you look to the side. Oh, that was...
Yeah, I had piles of wayside in my studio.
But when you weave tapestries, you're a little more controlled. You sort of plan it ahead. You have to plan it ahead. So that my life, and you will see there's a chart that we showed here, that I charted out everything. This is the sample for this particular work, and it is a vertical one. So this was the first thing that I wove to test it, and that's the actual bill. So there you see how it looked with the textured paper, and of course I had to flip it over to see the other side. And that's my chart. There you can see exactly what months, what days it took me to weave each one of those. And I have this chart from 1976, and how long is it? 50 feet long or something. So there you see it all stacked. But I can go to that and immediately find out when I did something and how long it took.
So is archiving your work something that both of you feel is important, or archiving the process of your work? Because you are both involved in kind of time-heavy practices. How interested are you in archiving that, and what do you use those kind of archives for? Toni,
For
perhaps?
Me, here you even see the first page. The book is called the recipe book, and that book I bought at Cranbrook in 1984 or something, so that's why I'm using it. And I'm looking at it, and I said to myself years ago, I think I'll do 300 before I die. And now I'm up to 278, I think, so I'm getting close. So, no, I like the charting, I'm crazy about it. It's idiotic, but... And we've also charted every day how many inches was done every day and who worked on it, and so that's another kind of chart. We have probably 6 different kinds of charts. Mostly for me to figure out how much I could charge, because it all has to do with earning a living. At least it was for me, that I was going to earn my living weaving tapestries. Now, of course, I went to visit Jack in 1965. The first day I was ever in New York, I met Jack Larson, and I told him what I intended to do, namely weave tapestries for corporate spaces. And he said, that'll never work. But I didn't hear it or something, because it did work. For me, it worked. But it took a lot of planning and a lot of focus to always be aware of your time and who, including all the contracts and all this, all the stuff, installations. And I've done many very large pieces, and it's been quite adventuresome. And sometimes I've had to take them down and hang them up again because the backing was so darn wrong. And so we were sitting in the bank in Atlanta on a stone floor, and they decided to bring in equipment to wash the windows the same night, since we were disturbing the lobby anyway. So we had to do all that stitching with that tremendous noise of that engine going, because they think you're just a worker. They don't, I brought tapestries to Pepsi Cola, a big suite, and they wouldn't let me bring it in through the front door. Now this is an interesting point. They wouldn't let me bring it in through the front door, because it was part of the construction or part of the working elements. And it was wrapped beautifully in sheets, and there was nothing dirty about it, but it was the idea that this piece is not worthy of the front door.
Well, that's a point I'd love to get to, but just before we get there, I'd love to hear from Toni about the idea of archiving in your work, or not.
Yeah, I'm not very organized. I wish I had more documentation. I've come to that sort of recently, and sometimes I start documenting and then I lose it. The kind of work that I've been doing over the last 10 years is so time and labor intensive that I have had an opportunity to document sort of that when I'm thinking. I'm so focused on just being in the work that is hard for me to get outside of myself to think about that. And like when I was doing this piece that was during lockdown, which ended up being 52 weavings that are hung together.
Yeah, beautiful.
I just was completely really unaware of what I was doing. Like I was just doing it, and I wish I had documented it, but it was such a focus and lifeline for me that I just was weaving, and that's all that I could do.
We choose I mean, I now have the world's best assistant, May, who's
Yeah.
sitting here.
I'm looking for the world's best assistant.
She is the world's best assistant to
But,
me.
you know, speaking of inches, I also document things in inches, because especially if I'm on a deadline, and whether it's clay or weaving work, I figure out by the inch where I need to be at the end of a certain time, because otherwise you're just like in this morass of, you know, who knows where.
The interesting thing about the COVID map of the United States you did, and the fact that perhaps you weren't as actively sort of planning in the beginning, is that isn't there a bit where you actually had to add one on to California because it kind of broke the curve?
Yeah, and I did. You know, I was certainly mapping. Like I put the months and years on the sides of my loom to track exactly where I was, but I worked my way from Maine across the United States. So by the time I got to California, it was probably 10 months later, and COVID had just gone completely crazy. So I did add more to that particular state as I moved across. Yeah. You can see the extra tiny little piece there. But, you know, I never even saw the whole thing assembled in my studio. My wall is not really big enough.
Did you have a meaning with the colors and the states?
Not any specific meaning. It was really what I was feeling that day. I did have red as a through line, partly to bring it all together, but also because red was such an indicator of risk. And it was interesting to me that part of the universal language about COVID was color, you know. So it was
Well, that's right.
red, yellow, green.
Yeah.
And, you know, there still exists a universal language that you really don't have to say much. Everybody knows what you're talking about. But it was a way for me to explore what was happening to us right then. And it was a really transitional moment, I think, for me to be doing that work, because I think prior to this work, I had always had a very big interest in the effects of time. So the effects of time on objects, in archaeology, on what used to exist inside of things, the patina of things. And I set up materials to kind of interact with nature and hope that certain things will happen by what I've done to set them up. But when the pandemic hit, my focus really became more about the effects of time on myself and what that meant, and the confusion of days and time that I think we all experienced, which I also explored through a metal chair installation. But that was, I think, a very big shift for me that I didn't realize was happening at the time, but, you know, there was a constant, is this Wednesday? Or was that Saturday? And it just, and it's still, I think, we're,
It makes me think of sort of Penelope weaving her father-in-law's shroud by day and unweaving it at night, so that, because since Odysseus hadn't come home, the only way to avoid the suitors was, she said, I'll choose a new husband when I finished my father-in-law's shroud. And of course, the only way to sort of stave that off, and I think it took them 3 years to figure it out, but she would weave every day, and then at night they would unpick it. But there's something, it does just feel that somehow the idea of weaving, I mean, maybe it's just weaving's association with time, it feels like the most appropriate thing you could have done during lockdown. Sorry, Eric, I know you were in the studio all the time, but there's something about weaving and lockdown that just seems culturally so much a thing.
It was honestly a life raft for me, and it had such direction and purpose, and it's so meditative, and it's very much related to my clay practice, which is also this kind of aggregate, slow building of forms that they seem the same to me, and there's certainly an obsessive component, if not the biggest component, to weaving, and so, you know, it makes everything else go away. Yet with that piece, it wasn't completely away because I was constantly looking at the graphs and trying to really understand what those graphs were saying and what information was missing and what was context. But that methodical back and forth is just incredibly satisfying.
Well, I find just concentrating on exactly what you want to achieve. In this case, I didn't use a lot of different colors, but it was always a matter of making sure that every single thread was in the right place in this case. And during COVID, I wove a tapestry very slowly, but very deliberate. That was the one that was shown here last time I was here. So I love the fact that you forget time and space when you're doing it. And it's wonderful to just all the time try to achieve the right color combination, the right, exactly how you want it to. It's totally absorbing. And I can't think of anything more wonderful to do, actually, and that's why I've done it all my life.
It's a deep rabbit hole, I have to say. I like really fell in really deep. The other really great thing is that, you know, with clay is very demanding in terms of when and how you work with it. And you may try to keep it really damp, but that doesn't always work. And then it's too dry, it's too wet, it's humid out, it's not humid out. So there are all these variables, which was challenging as a single mother. And your kids are sick, you got to go get them at school, and you have to stop, and then you can't get back. And so the shift to work on paper and weaving was really kind of a gift in that way, because I could just put it down, I could leave, and I could come back.
Well, it's a very natural way to spend your time. I mean, before the Industrial Revolution, everybody lived in this world of... Is this working? Sorry. Everybody lived in the world of making what you need and doing it at the right time of the year and following patterns. After the Industrial Revolution, of course, everything changed, and people ended up working in factories, and I can't say that I think that was a happy thing for, except production got cheaper and so on, we know all about it. But so from my background, what I had was a number of mentors, women, who lived on their tapestry work or textile work. So for me, to follow them was not a big deal at all. I had several mentors. What was different about me was that I was willing to move to North America and then decide to try to hang tapestries in American corporations, which of course I had no idea in any way what it would be different than Sweden. But the big difference is that in Sweden, all art is supported by the government, more or less. You get commissions from the government. Here you have to go out and find them. So that was different. So fortunately, I knew how to approach architects, and I started out, and I did 2 trips around the United States to just tell people what I could do. And then it rolled on from there. I mean, I say now that the reason those architects were interested to see me was that they had admired Scandinavian design. They were of the age when that was on the opera. And that made, I think, a huge difference, that they wanted to see me at all. And then they all thought, oh, we thought you were going to be 80 years old. We thought you would be Annie Albers. And of course I wasn't. I was 24, wearing a miniskirt. But somehow or other, we got past those problems, and I had my studio in Montreal for 7 years, in England for 3.5 years, New York for 5 years, and the rest here in Connecticut, in Ridgefield. So I moved it all around too, but that hasn't stopped me, and yeah.
That's perhaps a really interesting jumping off point to get back to this idea of the work coming in the back door, which just seems like a really pregnant metaphor. I'm interested that you certainly, Helena, saw a kind of embrace of fiber arts in the 60s and 70s, and then you saw sort of it go fallow. And if I am right, I think that you are seeing now an uptick of interest again. And I would also like to ask you, Toni, afterwards, about your sort of jump, which you've explained from clay to obviously fiber, but also from this idea of site-specific going to site-specific. So Helena, let's start with you, and then Toni, perhaps if you can build on that, that would be great.
Well, I obviously needed help, so that was, and so what I did as an immigrant, I had a wonderful opportunity to give work back to Sweden. So instead of paying, sending the work to China or India, I decided I'd pay what it cost. I would have to charge enough for that, and of course it cost more, although those weavers in Sweden were certainly not earning much money. But I wanted to keep that business going. And it was very near disappearing several times. But fortunately, I was able to come with a job just at the right time. And that, I add quickly, the same thing happened with my husband, Nils Diffrient, who was a chair designer. When he ran dry for some years, those were the years when I was making the money. So it went just right. And then afterwards, when his chair started to sell, I didn't, then it was one. But I helped him too, in a way. But of course, you want that. You want the circumstance around you to roll along. So it's very important to have good people you work with, and that everyone has an attitude of positive. We can do this. And the job we did for Hudson Yards was 4 years that we had to solve the problem of installing a tapestry in the ceiling as well as on the wall. And that was our last big commission, and it took the air out of all of us. It was really something. But it is in an elevator lobby at 35 Hudson Yards. And I already had tapestries at the Time Warner Center in the residential lobby, the same developer. And he had 4 made to rotate. So that, what can be better? Somebody who buys enough to rotate them, because then it's more interesting when it changes. It's not interesting to see the same thing for decades. Then you don't see it anymore. So that's another important lesson.
Remind me what you would like me to...
So what I'm interested in is your kind of work with what is site-specific. And eventually I'd like to get to this idea of the longevity of your work, but I think the idea of site-specific and how certainly the piece upstairs shows how you go from one site-specific, allowing it to evolve into another.
Right. So in the course of these images, there is a photograph of Time and Again, which is upstairs in its original manifestation. So will you tell me when we get there?
Yep.
Okay. I had been working fairly small scale before doing these kind of site-specific works, but when I was invited to do the Parish Roadshow, I ended up, I just loved these boulders that were on site in Bridgehampton. So this is the piece that's upstairs, which is a panel that was part of a larger installation. This is also a panel from that same installation that I'd done at Longhouse, which were 3 cubes these are 2 of the cubes. So those are like 12 by 12 feet each, and they're wrapped around trees that are at Longhouse. And at the time, I didn't really think of them as weaving. I just simply thought of them as structures, and it was called Sanctuary Entwined. And it was both an homage to Jack and his legacy in textiles, but it was also my commentary on, or thoughts about what it meant to be safe at a time when ICE was very present here. Lots of parents were being deported. I'd been to a bunch of meetings where they were preparing parents to be removed from their families. And so that piece stayed on site for about 9 months and then weathered. And then I had to take it down, which is always this kind of, there's a grieving that goes along with that, although a lot of my work is ephemeral, and I do need to do very extensive documentation of it, because once it's gone, it's gone. But each of the panels then seemed incredibly beautiful to me, so I continued to age a bunch of them, which is what you see upstairs and what you saw in the other photograph. And I have this admiration for that, the aging of the materials, and so I'm very drawn to natural materials, but that then leads me to doing outdoor works that are not permanent. And I both like that. I like that it's here and then it's gone, that I'm not staking this claim on this piece of land, but there is definitely a sadness in the taking it down. I was talking to Helena earlier, like with Finding Beauty in a Dark Place, the 52 weavings, when it was acquired by the Brooklyn Museum, and I was packing it up, and I was taking each piece down. And first of all, I hadn't really been with each of the weavings alone like that, you know, individually for quite a while, because I'd been showing the piece. But there was such a sadness at obviously excitement, but also a sadness in giving it up. Like, there is no other piece like this. This is the only one that will ever. I lived in this piece for a year. My hands were in it. My mind was in it. I was touching it for, you know, a solid year. That's just, and then it's in a Tupperware container and it's at the Brooklyn Museum, which hopefully will go on exhibit soon. But there's this definite mix of emotions with it, because you're just, there's so much time. And then it's off and away. Oh. Did that answer the question? Okay.
It has its own energy.
Yeah.
It moves on.
Yeah. No, I had some weavings that were on view earlier this summer, and they had not sold. And so I was very happy to get them back, and then they sold the last day. And I was like, wait, I thought they were coming home for the summer. I was like, oh.
So I'm interested, I mean, both of you have talked about this, but in different ways, about the idea of the longevity of your work. Helena, you've talked about one commission where they actually acquired 4 versions of it, so that would be rotating.
No,
so
not versions,
different, but 4 tapestries. Yeah. So in other words, any of the light damage that could happen would be lessened, because you're kind of changing that. So I'm interested in your idea of the longevity of your work. And then, Toni, I'd love to talk to you, because the piece upstairs is so precarious. You know, what do you've talked about letting go of works when they're site-specific. What about kind of the long-term future of work in that arena?
Well, I don't expect mine to disappear anytime soon, because I don't expose them to that kind of risk. So we have them rolled up and we ship them around for exhibitions and so on. I think it's terrific that I had the opportunity to leave behind a record of a certain time. And each one occupies his own time. And in some of my work, of course, it reflects, like in the newspapers, where it was all about what happened right then. But in most ways, everything I do reflects exactly the time I'm in then. And that feels very at home. It feels like you are home in your work and in your life. And I've never ever thought that I would do anything else, actually. So, but I have trained people and taught them my technique, and over some years in workshops for 2 weeks tours. And that group of 50 people are still rolling like a snowball. They have shows every year. They get together, they got to know each other. They live all over Sweden, but they join in this work. And it is mostly women, of course, older, who are in retirement, who have the time, but even the younger ones want to be part of. So I've started something that rolls on its own, and I think that's fantastic also. Yeah.
I think some of the site responsive work that I do is ephemeral, like these giant cubes that I did out of straw that were wrapping these boulders. And they morphed over time. I also I tend to outstay my welcome. I get invited to install something for a month, and then I'm like, can I just leave it here like another few months and another few months? So things grew in there, animals started living in there, and that was all. And I documented all of that. With this piece, these pieces are quite stable. Now they have done whatever it is they're going to do, and they're protected, and they are what they are. I have taken some of the panels and stripped them back because they were too degraded, and wrapped them, and I've woven into those, and I've then woven into some of the ones that had kind of some of that patina on them. And then the site responsive work that, like this is completely stable. And all I did really was just to cut it free from the bottom. But the interesting thing about hemp is that it kind of has a life of its own, and it also retains this memory of what it was doing. So it retains any bend that it had or any crease that it had from a knot. And the other really cool thing is that, see, this is where I think it all started, was I was wrapping my ceramic work in string as a resist, a form of resist. So wherever the string was, either the glaze wasn't touching the piece or the fire was not touching the things that I had put on the clay. And so you would be left after the firing, you would burn the string off. And so there'd just be these ghost images of the string. And I had a whole bunch of work lined up to put in the kiln. It was all wrapped and tied and bound, and I just looked at this table full of stuff, and I was like, why would I burn that off? These are really beautiful. And so I started this whole series of wrapping with thread, and then I think that led to where I am now. But this installation that just appeared is at the Amagansett Life Saving Station, where Alice Hope and Bastian Schmidt also have work. And although it's all site responsive, the pieces that are there can be seen in another format and another venue. Like when I was working on that weaving that's on the bed, it was hanging on my wall, and it has a different sense to it, but I find it also very, very beautiful. But being on that bed in that space at this time means something slightly different than it would on the wall. But again, with this type of work, it's incredibly important to document it, which I've really tried to be careful about.
So I want to open it up to questions, but just before I do, I want to ask you both what you are most excited about at the moment, or what you are looking forward to doing in your work in the next coming months.
I'm sort of between. I'm
it's off again.
Yeah. I'm between projects, really, but what we're doing is I may be moving in a few years, and I'm starting looking at my inventory and what to do about that. But in the weaving, I decided all of a sudden I'd go back to a design I did in 1964, before I had started any realism. And it was an abstract. So that's on the loom, and I've sort of promised myself over the years that yes, I will go back one day and see if that was something I felt the same about. And so that's what I'm doing right now. But of course, I'm planning ahead what to do. And the tapestry I finished recently, called Afterwards, I was at the wedding in Italy, and I took many photographs from that event, and I'm thinking to look through if there's another one to use from that event, because it had a very special atmosphere. So that's in between, moving between houses, and it's a bit complicated right now for me. So that's how it is.
Toni?
That's a good question. I'm also between projects, which is not a place I actually am comfortable in or like. But I was doing a series of weavings that were informed by my month in Africa. And so I'm hoping to return to those. I hope to go back to Africa, in which case I would just as soon do them there. But we'll see what happens with that. And then I have a new series of, this. So this was my newest series of weavings. This is called Ischemic Grid, and it's a kind of invented alphabet. I have a lot of interest in sort of the rhythm of language, and this, it's sort of a commentary on the frustration of our inability to communicate right now. And so I want to see where that can take me. I have some ideas about how that could change and morph. So I have a few of those already done, and I'd like to work on those. And then hopefully the Finding Beauty will go to be exhibited at the museum in the spring. And I'm planning on starting work on a companion book for that, and I've never done a book, kind of an artist's book, not a big published, run book. So I'm looking forward to that, and then just being quiet in the studio to see then what comes. It's been a very, very busy summer in an extraordinary way, but I'm looking forward to making space for what comes next.
It makes me think that an artist really creates their own life. And it's very nice to dive into it and forget everything else.
Yes. And also I rebuilt my kiln. So the plan was to do a bunch of clay. I'm not really able to do both at the same time there, because, but I may actually need to move out of my studio for a while, so I'm not sure what's going to happen with that. With the weaving, the nice thing is the way that I work, I can take it with me anywhere. So I have to see what happens with that.
Do you use an actual loom, or do you just do frames?
I just use like a child's lap loom.
Mm-hmm.
And I love it, and I love that it's portable. And I like working in this way that is aggregate, like it's exciting to me to see something build from smaller pieces. I've only done a very small amount of work on a floor loom, and I really, really, really admire you.
Well, thank you, but maybe my imagination has to be kept in check in a way, except while I'm doing it, because I'm inventing all the time.
Right.
Every minute.
Right. The good news about like not knowing a lot about a material or like exploring something new is you don't know you can't do it.
Well, that's good.
So
that's very good.
There are all these fantastic things that happen because of that. Because if you know too many rules, it can kind of hang you up.
I have one rule.
What's your rule?
Do what's most fun first.
Questions from the audience?
Hi, Susan.
Well, I've had the great privilege of knowing Helena's work for 40 years, and great admirer, and I have been in her spaces, which are extraordinary. But I don't know how many people are familiar enough to know how large scale some of Helena's work is. It's quite phenomenal. Can you talk a little bit about the scale of your, not the work here, but the other work?
The biggest one we did took 2 years to make in one. It's actually in 3 parts, but it's 80 feet long and 11 feet tall. And it was in a lobby in Boston in a curve. So So that was the biggest, but the Hudson Yards wasn't so big. It was 2 sets, but each set had 3 parts to it. So it added up, and it took time because we also had to build a full-scale model of the elevator lobby in the studio so we could test how to hang it up and make it stay straight across 8 feet. So that was our challenge. We succeeded, strangely to say. But that was a big team. Then in Sweden there were 3 people, and in the States there's 2 people, sometimes 3. So we had this business of testing takes a lot of time, and then finding the right material to build the structure with. But it was an interesting exercise. I thought the client would do it, but of course he didn't lift a finger in this direction. So then you say, okay, we'll do it. And it was fun. May knows a lot about it, my assistant who's here. She was very active in this. No, the sizes have on the whole been 200 square feet, 400 square feet, those sizes, and they take quite a lot of time to do. And so I'm now going back to small, so 8 by 8 inches. And I have done a piece that size, which I think is one of my best. So there's hope. Yes?
I remember in your studio you would climb a ladder and then look at the piece you're weaving.
Oh yes, this is how to see how it works at a distance. You need to have a binocular or monocular, and look through the wrong end in order to get the distance. But in my studio, I can go up 3 floors and look down on the loom, and that helps too. So that's how we see if it works, what we're doing. But you only see a strip. You never see the whole thing until it's done. So you only have a sort of 6 or 7 inch strip that you can see. Then it rolls under the loom, and you don't want to let go of the tension, because that can be difficult. So it is a strange way to work art, actually. But of course we have blow-ups with the whole picture, and we have the design with the whole picture, so we know where we are, what we're doing.
I always thought that was so creative because it was just like a bird's eye view and you could read what you were weaving.
Yeah. Well, all those tricks I learned from my teacher, Edna Martin. Also to blow up, don't blow up on graph paper, photographically blow it up, because then if a line is drawn fast, you have that speed captured. But if you do it on graph paper, then it loses something. So those were some of the tricks, or lessons we learned, I should say.
And I just had one other question. Would you be willing or able to share yarn sources? Because I used to use yarn sources that were moth-proof and dye fast, and in the past 3 years they've dried up. And, you know, it's just, I don't know where to go.
Well, the same has happened to me. I don't know, it's too long a story. It's a special sheep grown in Sweden called the Raya sheep, and certain farmers would have them. But it's extra, you're breeding the sheep, that's one thing, but you also need to breed white sheep so that you can dye on white. And that's extra work. And when Sweden joined EU, suddenly they all had to depend on money from EU, which you have to write every year to apply for. Well, these farmers don't have time to do that, so they drop it. You know, that's just one problem too many. So, well, it's a long, long story if you talk about material and yarns. But you're right, they are harder to come by. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe in Finland still breed the same sheep. But that's only because I want a long fiber, because I want my yarn to be glossy. And the long fiber was what the Vikings were using and everybody. But with the Industrial Revolution, they built spinning machines that only could use short fibers. Whereupon it all became merino, and all those English sheep took over. And they aren't as glossy. So there you have it.
I have a question.
Yes.
I've talked to a lot of you musicians. How did you come to that instrument, playing the oboe, the cello, the violin? And their wonderful stories as they explored their passion for music and said, this is it. What I want to know from the two of you is, with your eye and your skills, when was the moment you said, fiber is where I want to be? How did you come to that decision?
To work with fiber?
Yeah.
Well, for me, it was no choice. What am I doing wrong with this? To me, it was no choice. I was going to use a loom. And the fibers we use are, of course, cotton and linen and wool, but mostly wool, because they absorb the dye so beautifully. Linen has a gloss to it, so that's nice to use as well, and I use it here and there. But the dyed wool is absolutely the best. And there was a family business who lived on for 100 years, and they just died in 2018. They ran out because people manning the spinning machine, which was more or less a hand spinning, the young man who knew how to run that died all of a sudden, and he had not passed along that knowledge to his son. And it was terrible, yeah. And there were other problems too, but...
But Helena, you could do anything visually. When was the moment you knew that it was going to be fabric?
that it was...
When did you make that decision? This is the medium I want.
Oh, I was a teenager, and my father took me to meet the woman who owned the business that I later saved. So I was, yeah, it's true. Alice Lund, she had the weavers on the ground floor, she lived up above, and she made all kinds of textiles for interiors. Some of it was fine art, but it was a lot carpet and everything. She had 19 weavers then, before the textile crisis of 1960, when all of a sudden the Polish people were doing hand weaving cheaper than the Swedes. It wiped out the Swedish hand weaving business. So then they switched to doing more artwork and had eventually fewer weavers that, like me, then I entered the scene. And I managed to, they've done 24 of my important works, have been done in Sweden. And I have felt that I wanted the weavers to have the same culture as I had, because I wanted the understanding of what we're doing to be totally deep. And so I also didn't want to fly to China and try to find cheaper manufacturing, because I felt the Scandinavian handwork was tremendous. It's just too bad that nobody can afford to buy it anymore. But so I was able to swing that I could buy it. And so I kept it good. Now the young woman who owns that business, she's another discovery of mine, or she discovered me. But she's 35 years old, and she's taken on the whole thing. And it looks like, thanks to the Swedish Commission for the Arts, and there are other, art is supported in Sweden, not only by private individuals. And the church is a big buyer of textiles. So she has her customer base. And it looks hopeful. But it is amazing in this day and age. But I think so many people realize that the internet world is very, very unsatisfying. And you want to do things with your own hands. And you want to spend the time. And I don't know how this is going to end up. But I think more people will give up on the internet. That's what I think.
I would love to hear your colleague describe how this meeting came.
How what?
How you chose.
How I came to it? It was a slow process, and I don't really consider myself necessarily a weaver, because I generally will use materials that suit the purpose of what I'm trying to do. So I move back and forth between materials, whether it's wool, yarn, string, twine, clay, metal chairs, wood, kind of whatever works for what I'm doing is the material that I use. That being said, when I really came to know Annie Albers and Sheila Hicks and these other artists who were working so intensively with fiber, it like touches a place in my soul that I just, it makes me cry. I feel it so deeply, and so when I'm working with the materials, I feel that way. And it's very soothing and exciting to me to be on a loom, there's something very reassuring about the grid of a loom. I think it's sort of a false sense of security, but it offers some kind of organization that then kind of, in my work, kind of goes off a bit, which is what I like. You know, I let it kind of go a little bit wonky, and I leave things, pieces hanging, and I like that the weaving isn't exactly straight, and so I like working. But I've always really liked working with materials that I can really have my hands in. So whether it's clay, charcoal, I'm like covered in charcoal if I'm drawing with charcoal. So, you know, I just, it's what I'm doing right now. I see doing it for a very long time, but I don't see it to the exclusion of other materials. And maybe mixing materials, I don't know.
Thank you for wonderful answers.
I wanted to ask a follow-up question of Helena. There's in both the piece upstairs and in the one that you so graciously brought when you gave your talk here, which I thought was stunning. And for those of you who didn't see it, it's kind of like looking at a cross between a Manet and a Vermeer. It's so light-drenched, it's so insanely rich. And I hadn't heard you mention the specificity of linen, wool, and cotton before. I just was wondering, so when you're doing a piece like that, for instance, do you ever, I guess we would call it mixed media in the painting world, would you ever mix cotton, flax, and wool in order to get certain effects? Like if wool is more glossy, is that what you would choose for something that you wanted to embody light? I might sound like a crazy literalist because I don't know enough about weaving, but I was just curious about that.
That's very observant, but that's exactly what it is. I don't use cotton very often, actually, because it's so matte. But I do use linen, and I mix it with the wool in different. And the warp is often linen. And my warp shows up. It isn't hidden, because I don't weave I don't pack it down. And the reason I don't pack it down is that the backside of that tapestry and others the same, I use what's left over when they make sequins. You can buy a roll 4 inches high filled with holes, like a honeycomb, and they come in different sizes, those holes. So I take that roll, which is 4 inches, and I fold it 3 times, so I have a strip that suits my weft. And it allows 4 layers of that plastic to go in, 1 in the bottom layer, 1 in the middle. So I have a very firm structure in the background, and you don't see much of it. It just makes it firm. Then I can weave the wool softer and not pack it. Allow air to be in the wool, and that picks up some of these points about looking like a Vermeer. I don't know how I do that, but somehow or other it has a glow. But I'm also very aware of the complementary color, that if you use just one little strand of the complementary color in its opposite, it makes it shine more. Because Vermeer used to paint a background in one color and then do the complementary color on top. It's the same thing. It's a fascinating thing to play with, the degree of complement. And so on my yarn table, I'll have 100 balls of yarn, and I'm just picking and then I weave with a bundle of maybe 12 threads. And those 12 threads, I exchange 1 or 2 now and then if I wanted. So I can drift the color in infinitesimal detail to to achieve that effect that I'm looking for. No wonder it takes time. It takes endless time. But it's that piece, I was surprised myself what I achieved with that. But it partly had to do with the structure in the back and the fact that I wove it softer, and the fact that it was such a gorgeous photograph that I happened to have taken of from that wedding. So maybe there'll be more.
You had, sorry, just one quick question, because you reminded me of one thing, which is that, Helena, you said in Swedish there are 3 words where in English we only have 2. In English we have art and we have craft, and you said that there is a sort of third term.
Konsthantverk, art, art, handwork, konsthantverk. And when I was growing up, it had this whole department in the Museum of Decorative Arts. My father ran such a department in the National Museum, and it entailed things made of wood, made of clay, and made of textiles, and silver. So that was Konsthantverk, and everybody respected it and knew what it was and so on. It's not fine art, it's not just craft. And so it was a world unto itself. And then all of a sudden, in the early 90s, I think, the Swedish school system decided to turn itself into a complementary system to the United States. Well, at that point, the word Konsthantverk disappeared. And I was furious. I mean, I thought it was terrible. And I felt it was a terrible thing to do, to drop it. But it didn't fit the American system, so they dropped it in the teaching. So much for the word Konsthantverk.
I have a question for each one of you, and these lectures are so fascinating, and it's like they could go on, or it could be a lecture series, at least to me. I want to ask Toni, I saw your boxes in wrapping the trees. I was there, and it seemed to me that you could go inside, and I did go inside. So I experienced safety, but it was ephemeral safety. And your piece here reminds me of a certain kind of loose ephemera. It's got a lot of air. It could almost, the lines could almost disintegrate. So that's what I wanted to say. And also, I really love your almost linguistic composite of letters that aren't letters. That's like a big piece for me. And I noticed, Helena, that you're going to be doing 8-by-8-inch weavings, and I'm fascinated to know, after doing such huge pieces with teams of people working for you, why you're doing 8-by-8 and how and what you're noticing there and what you want to accomplish in the diminishment.
Well, I've already done a few, so I've seen how well it went when I did it. But most it has to do with I'm cutting back on the commissions. I don't have to do them anymore. So, and I'm not being asked either, actually. So it's natural that I want to make it more portable because I'm moving around more. So small is beautiful at the moment.
Toni?
I don't think there was a question. Was there a question? I'm sorry.
Well put, Toni.
No, I'm sorry. It didn't. I heard you commenting, but did you want me to respond?
Well, I can ask you.
Okay.
Are you going to continue to work with composites as a possibility? In other words, not one piece, but all these little pieces and how they, because it's a different way of.
Yeah, no, I find that I love working in series and in grids like this, or in Finding Beauty with, there's something really exciting to me about that building process and the relationality from one piece to the next. The pieces change according to where they are in the order and the energy that they create from one to the next. And so that even with the piece that I did at Longhouse and the one I had done with the straw bales, I sort of see them as kind of still lifes, you know, and groupings that have an energy within each other. I'm so glad you got to go inside of those cubes, because there was a whole other experience in there that were almost like paintings in there, depending on where the light was. And you captured it beautifully in saying that it felt safe, but not really. And that was really the point, one of the points that I had with that work. Also, I just want to say that there's a piece that's lying on the beach. I think it's the last one in this series, which is going to be exhibited tonight for the first time on East Hampton, Maine Beach as part of the Guildhall offsite program. Alice is showing there, and I think there's about 12 other artists from 7 to 10 tonight, just to plug that. But I really, that one. I love working in grids. I can't really explain it. I love it. And also my clay work, I've often worked with like series of cubes and grouping things.
Well, oh, okay, one more question.
Hi there. When do you both feel most inspired? When you're at peace or when something's bothering you?
What was the beginning? I didn't hear.
When do you feel most inspired? When you're at peace or when you are...
I don't know. It's probably different for different times. I can't pinpoint that particularly. But maybe you can.
A lot of my work is politically responsive, so I guess I would say the latter. And it's just often trying to resolve a question that I have for myself. Gosh, but then being in the studio is what is peaceful. I think what drives the work is a discomfort, and then being in the studio is peaceful. Not between projects.
Well, I hope you both get back into the studio soon, and thank you so much for coming today. Thank you for your loans to the work, and thank you also to the audience for coming this afternoon.